Welcome back to IntelX, where we decode the world's most complex military operations and geopolitical strategies. If you're fascinated by modern warfare, intelligence operations, and the hidden battles shaping our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. September 12, 2025. The hour hand barely touched midnight. Along the frigid shores of the Baltic Sea, darkness enveloped the Primorsk oil port like a thick blanket. Two colossal tankers, vessels belonging to what international observers had come to call Russia's shadow fleet, sat motionless at their berths, quietly preparing to receive their liquid gold, millions upon millions of barrels of crude oil destined for markets across the globe. The scene appeared routine, mundane even. Just another night in the endless cycle of Russia's petroleum export machine. But hundreds of kilometers to the south, something extraordinary was unfolding. On the luminous display of a Nebo-M long-range VHF radar installation, an operator's eyes widened with disbelief. What materialized before him defied every standard protocol, every predictable pattern he'd been trained to recognize. More than 70 unidentified contacts, each bearing the telltale signature of a low radar cross-section, were pushing relentlessly northward into Russian-controlled airspace. The swarm stretched across a front exceeding 1,000 kilometers. Intelligence analysts would later calculate that these aerial signatures represented a combined explosive payload surpassing 3 metric tons, enough destructive power to reshape the strategic landscape in a single night. Within moments, alarm klaxons began their haunting wail throughout the Leningrad Oblast Air Defense Command Center. The Nebo-M's readings were swiftly corroborated by the N-6E Big Bird Wide Area Surveillance System, a radar platform renowned throughout military circles for its exceptional detection capabilities. There could be no mistake, no sensor malfunction. The threat was real, immediate, and massive. What those Russian commanders didn't yet realize was that the groundwork for this audacious operation had been meticulously laid months earlier in secure planning facilities deep within Kiev. The challenge facing Ukrainian military planners had been monumental. The 1,000-kilometer distance alone presented a formidable obstacle. But the true nightmare lay in what NATO analysts had long designated as an anti-access area denial zone, commonly abbreviated as A2AD. A sophisticated, multi-layered defensive network that Russia had painstakingly constructed along this entire strategic corridor. Yet inside the command centers surrounding St. Petersburg, Russian generals remained remarkably composed, almost serene. After all, wasn't this precisely the scenario their expensive, cutting-edge systems had been engineered to counter? Russia's integrated air defense architecture, a 3-tiered network of overlapping coverage zones, activated with mechanical precision. The 92 N-6E gravestone engagement radars belonging to S-400 batteries encircling St. Petersburg began methodically acquiring targets, painting them with targeting solutions one after another. At lower altitudes, Pantsir S-1 batteries created what could only be described as a curtain of shredded metal, their twin 2A38M 30mm cannons spitting death skyward at a devastating rate of 5,000 rounds per minute. The Russian operators watched with grim satisfaction as contacts began disappearing from their screens. But what they were witnessing wasn't chaos, it was choreography. This wasn't a desperate, disorganized assault, it was an intricately orchestrated deception, a masterclass in military misdirection executed on a scale rarely seen in modern warfare. To deliberately draw Russia's defensive umbrella away from Primorsk, Ukrainian planners had launched waves upon waves of decoy platforms. These sacrificial units were specifically vectored toward the villages of Zelenogorsk, Tosno, Pavlovsk, and Vyborg, as well as the Lomonosov district within Leningrad Oblast. Simultaneously, additional swarms descended upon the districts of Volosovo, Tosnensky, Gatchinsky, Lomonosovsky, and Pushkinsky within St. Petersburg proper, completely monopolizing the attention of the region's most formidable S-400 batteries. In a hardened air defense bunker somewhere in Gatchinsky district, a young Russian lieutenant watched the final hostile signature in his assigned sector blink out of existence. With practiced efficiency, he transmitted his standard status update to the command hierarchy. Sector clear, all targets neutralized. That report, as it filtered upward through the chain of command, would facilitate what these generals would later recognize as the most catastrophic misjudgment of their professional lives. What they interpreted as triumph was, in reality, a carefully constructed trap. The Ukrainian operation had committed more than 70 unmanned aerial platforms to the Leningrad and St. Petersburg regions. Of this force, 35 AQ-400 Scythe drones were tasked exclusively with saturating St. Petersburg's defenses. The remaining 40 formed the primary strike package, dispersed across the vast expanse of Leningrad Oblast. Embedded within this formation were 15 UJ-26 Bauber ER drones, the true assassination squad, assigned the critical mission of penetrating to Primorsk port itself. The success of this elaborate gambit hinged on a calculated assumption that enough of the 40 drones vectoring toward Leningrad would somehow survive the hellish gauntlet of fire and steel to reach their designated objectives. Every component, every technical specification, every tactical decision had to align perfectly. The UJ-26 Bauber ER platform selected for this mission represented the cutting edge of Ukrainian drone warfare. Standard Bauber variants simply lacked the necessary operational range. However, these ER extended range variants had been specifically engineered for precisely this type of deep penetration strike. Equipped with supplementary fuel tanks and running optimized engine management software, they represented the only kamikaze platforms in Ukraine's arsenal capable of completing a 1,000-kilometer one-way journey while still carrying a 40-kilogram warhead. Similar modifications had been implemented for the electronic warfare platforms designated Banshee 7, which would provide critical support throughout the mission. Standard EW drones couldn't maintain pace with the strike package across such distances. Consequently, the Banshee 7 units were constructed on the same extended-range airframe as the Bauber ER, but instead of explosives, they carried sophisticated jamming pods and enhanced antenna arrays. Their mission was singular: escort the Bauber drones across the entire 1,000-kilometer route, providing electronic cover at every stage. The AQ-400 Scythe had been selected as the sacrificial decoy for practical reasons. Its plywood construction not only generated a minimal radar signature, but also facilitated rapid mass production. Hundreds of these expendable platforms could be manufactured quickly and inexpensively, precisely what a saturation attack demanded. As midnight descended, more than 70 drones lifted off from dispersed locations throughout Ukrainian-controlled territory, immediately dropping to terrain-hugging altitudes as they began their infiltration of Russian airspace. The initial hours unfolded in absolute radio silence, flying nap of the Earth profiles. The drones navigated using preloaded digital terrain databases, threading their way through river valleys and forested corridors, remaining well below the coverage envelope of Russia's primary radar networks. This phase represented a severe test of each platform's autonomous navigation capabilities. Several drones were inevitably lost during this treacherous passage, some colliding with terrain features, others succumbing to mechanical failures. These casualties had been factored into the operational planning from the very beginning. Once the formation crossed into Russian territory, the tactical parameters shifted dramatically. Concealment was no longer the priority, survival was. When Russia's air defense network finally stirred to full alertness, its response unfolded exactly as Ukrainian planners had anticipated. As the 91N6E Big Bird radars detected this massive yet dispersed swarm approaching from hundreds of kilometers away, the system's automated threat assessment algorithms prioritized the cluster it perceived as most dangerous, the 35 Scythes vectoring directly towards St. Petersburg. Massive 48 N6 series missiles erupted from S-400 launchers, hunting down these cheap plywood targets with ruthless efficiency. From the Russian perspective, this represented textbook air defense. From the Ukrainian perspective, it was the opening gambit, the first deliberate sacrifice on an intricate chessboard. Meanwhile, the remaining 40 drones scattered across the Leningrad countryside initiated a deadly game of hide-and-seek with Pantsir and Buk systems. Near Volosovo, a Pantsir S-1 battery achieved lock on a low-flying UJ-26 Bauber. The Pantsir's 1RS-2-1E tracking radar had captured the target with crystal clarity. The Russian operator could observe every telemetry parameter on his fire control display: altitude, velocity, heading, range. What he couldn't see was that the Ukrainian operator controlling that Bauber was simultaneously observing the Pantsir's radar emissions on his own screen. He remained calm. A nearby Banshee 7 had already initiated its countermeasure sequence. The Banshee detected the Pantsir's X-band frequency signature and unleashed such an intense jamming pulse on that identical frequency that the Russian operator's screen instantaneously whited out completely. Target lock broken. In desperation, the operator triggered his two A-38M cannons, unleashing a torrent of 30mm rounds into the darkness. But the Bober had already slipped through the barrage, vanishing into the night like a ghost. This scenario repeated itself dozens of times throughout that long, violent night. The Russians were tenacious, and their firepower was overwhelming. Across the heart of Leningrad Oblast, they successfully brought down 33 drones in a spectacular display of fire and metal. Every single platform heading toward central St. Petersburg was obliterated. For Ukraine, however, these weren't defeats. They were investments. Each drone that fell created a gap, a momentary blind spot through which another platform could slip through from behind. Because while that young lieutenant was transmitting his confident all-clear report, 7 specially modified UJ-26 Bober ER drones had exploited the confusion, noise, and electromagnetic chaos to breach the primary defensive line. These 7 platforms, each carrying a precision 40-kilogram armor-piercing warhead, were now driving like surgical scalpels toward the economic heart of Russia's war machine. The Russian generals were examining only a tiny corner of an enormous canvas, completely missing the broader masterpiece being painted before them. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, the Pantsir battery assigned to protect Primorsk port itself detected 7 small, fast-moving contacts materializing on its radar display, approaching rapidly. Caught completely off guard, the operators scrambled to respond, launching 57 E-6 missiles from their tubes in a panicked volley. But the targets were too low, moving too fast, closing too quickly. The 7 Bober drones executed a final coordinated maneuver over the port complex, splitting into 2 strike packages, 3 vectored toward the pumping station, the beating heart of the entire facility. The Pantsir's missiles managed to intercept one of this trio just hundreds of meters from its intended target. That would be Russia's only consolation for the entire night. The remaining 2 Bober drones dove to fulfill their mission. The first, carrying a TBG-7V thermobaric warhead, impacted the station's main control building. The detonation consumed every molecule of oxygen within the enclosed space, generating a catastrophic pressure wave that blew the structure's walls outward like a house of cards. Seconds later, the second drone plunged directly into the main pipeline manifold. The explosion severed the port's circulatory system. Simultaneously, the remaining 4 Bober drones locked onto the 2 tankers waiting at the pier. 2 targeted the first vessel. The lead drone, equipped with a KZ-6-shaped charge warhead, struck just below the ship's bridge, annihilating all electronic systems housed within. The second drone impacted one of the main cargo tanks brimming with crude oil, igniting a massive conflagration. The final 2 Bober drones engaged the second tanker with nearly identical strike profiles. One targeted the engine room, the other struck the loading manifolds. The Shadow Fleet tankers bore the names Cousteau and Kailun, both Aframax-class vessels operating under what international maritime registers politely termed suspicious flags. Cousteau, managed by Solstice Corporation, displaced 115,000 deadweight tons. Kailun, registered to Axaronix Limited, operated at 110,000 deadweight tons. Both vessels existed in that murky gray zone of international shipping, their true ownership obscure, hid behind layers of shell companies and offshore registrations. At the moment of attack, both tankers were moored at the loading terminals, their tanks nearly filled to capacity. Then the drones arrived, and everything changed. The fires that erupted weren't merely tactical, they were strategic, because the impact points weren't simply storage tanks, they were the operational nerve centers of the shipping stations themselves. A mere 42 seconds after the first explosion, a second detonation collapsed Primorsk Port's No. 2 pumping station. The third drone penetrated the upper facade of the port's central control facility. In the cascade of electrical failures that followed, the entire complex automatically entered emergency shutdown protocol. But that shutdown command never fully propagated through the system because the core of the energy control infrastructure had also been struck. Drones 4 and 5 targeted the loading arms at the sterns of both tankers. Cousteau erupted in flames. Fuel began hemorrhaging from Kailun's ruptured tanks. Drones 6 and 7 struck the pump valve assemblies, and after these impacts, controlling the fires became impossible. Primorsk was burning. Within minutes, the port resembled a vision of hell. two massive tankers engulfed in flames, a devastated pumping station, and infrastructure damage that would take months to repair. Hours after the attack, the Russian Defense Ministry issued its standard statement. 221 Ukrainian drones intercepted and destroyed across the country overnight, all attacks successfully repelled. These numbers were meaningless when compared to the satellite imagery streaming from Primorsk, images showing billions of dollars in damage. The targets weren't random. Primorsk alone handled approximately 20% of Russia's seaborne oil exports. The targeted Aframax-class tankers, each capable of transporting roughly 700,000 barrels of crude, represented key assets within the Shadow Fleet network used to circumvent international sanctions. Primorsk port facilitated annual oil exports valued at $15 billion. The crude flowing through Primorsk served as the gateway for barrel-based shipments that were notoriously difficult to track and even harder to control. Oil sold to international Shadow Fleet operators who asked few questions. Closing this gateway directly impacted Russia's war funding. With an average daily throughput of 1 million barrels, the disruption translated to losses of approximately $70 to $80 million per day. That same morning, St. Petersburg's Pulkovo Airport activated its contingency protocols. 11 AI. Aircraft were diverted to alternate airports. The simultaneous entry of numerous UAVs into controlled airspace pushed civil-military air traffic management into crisis mode. When safety reflexes triggered from both radar and tower perspectives, operations automatically ground to a halt. Data from Leningrad Regional Administration and airport operators flowed to Russian state agencies. Cluttered radar screens over St. Petersburg, UAV wreckage scattered across the Leningrad countryside, debris fields falling outside residential zones. All of this kept operators' attention fixed upward while the decisive strike wave approached from the sea horizon, locked onto the terminal. From a technical perspective, Ukraine's long-range UAV concept achieved three critical objectives in this mission. First, it eliminated range calculation errors through the use of two distinct drone classes. Second, it exploited a fundamental flaw in Russian defensive doctrine. Their systems were optimized to intercept a small number of sophisticated targets. Ukraine's swarm tactics overwhelmed the decision-making architecture through sheer target saturation. Third, the success of EW platforms like the Banshee 7 wasn't about completely blinding Russian radars. It was about presenting them with so many false contacts and interference patterns that operators could no longer distinguish genuine threats from phantoms. Evidence of these systems was found among drone wreckage recovered around St. Petersburg. Components recovered in Vyborg and Pavlovsk indicated they were carrier platforms equipped with sophisticated navigation software. Ukraine hadn't just flown to strike, they'd flown to deceive. And that deception had rendered the actual target invisible until it was far too late. Confirmation arrived when footage of the fires proliferated across social media. The blazes couldn't be contained, and the official statement that followed left authorities no choice but to acknowledge the attack. Moreover, on a morning when the port was operating at maximum capacity, Russian command had failed to anticipate the strike. Primorsk had been considered a deep, well-protected, strategically secure facility. Despite the presence of major military formations, including the 6th Combined Arms Army in Leningrad Oblast, the 2nd Independent Motorized Division, and Baltic Fleet headquarters in the region, a critical defensive vulnerability existed. These units were predominantly positioned in defensive postures facing westward. In other words, they were looking outward toward NATO, not inward toward threats emerging from Ukrainian-controlled territory. The Russian officer corps simply hadn't conceived of this scenario. The naval base at Kronstadt, the artillery and rocket units along the Luga line, the air defense grids around Lomonosov, the command and control backbone along the Gatchina-Pushkin axis. This entire network had been operating under a conventional threat model for 3 years, with processes functioning according to a southeastern central Russian threat pattern. A drone attack deep enough to shut down a Baltic coast port had been deemed implausible under this model. The confluence of shift-change timing and simultaneous saturation of coastal radar bands produced critical delays. When these factors converged, a decisive window of infiltration opportunity materialized around the terminal. The real genius wasn't in the attack itself, it was in the surrounding deception that clouded the entire operational picture while the strike hit its target with surgical precise. Ukraine succeeded by gathering the right intelligence and selecting the optimal time window. The attack originated from outside, penetrated inward, and once inside, incinerated everything in its path. On paper, Russia's defensive umbrella in the region appeared formidable. In practice, when confronted with low-altitude sea-skimming profiles combined with synchronized false target clutter, it could produce catastrophic gaps during brief windows of vulnerability. This was precisely what occurred on the morning of September 12th. The radars were operational, the defensive lines responded as programmed, but the configuration proved inadequate to prevent low-profile drones from infiltrating the terminal. Flying at wave-top height, skimming the sea horizon, entering the line of sight of fixed antenna arrays only in the final moments. This geometry forces even top-tier systems like the S-400 into a race against time itself. By the time your radar acquires the target, it's already on top of you. The Bober's low-altitude profile meant that due to Earth's curvature, even the most powerful 91N6E Big Bird radars could only detect them at the final stage for an extremely brief window. This narrow time frame proved insufficient for effective interception. The dozens of destruction reports in the aerial battle picture amounted to nothing more than temporary closure decisions and district-by-district siren activations in Pulkovo and the skies over St. Petersburg. The result wasn't just a few hours of fire. It was a documented suspension of shadow fleet operations, marked for the first time by simultaneous fires aboard two vessels,